connect this thing to the aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve on the multiplier. Before I do that, though, I do want to make a last couple comments on what adding imports and what adding taxes would do to the multiplier. So in our example, the Keynesians kind of hang their hat on this spending multiplier. So there's a impact to real GDP and prosperity and the economy, right? This is our big Y here, by having a change in fiscal policy. And there's another multiplier that we're not going to spend time on looking at how that effect might be on taxes. So in the example we went through, we ended up having a multiplier of 5 times 50 equaled 250. So what I want you to think about is the direction of the change. So if we, this one is, remember, no taxes and no imports. If we add taxes, and let's be more specific, I guess, an income tax. If we add an income tax, then the multiplier will get what? Bigger or smaller? So think about that process. If we were to all of a sudden say, okay, new policy, taxes are going to be 20% of your income, would that tend to increase the multiplier or decrease it?
Are they still, like, is the government still spending
50. So that hasn't changed. So they spend 50.
But does that include the taxes, or will there be tax?
That's what Chelsea was asking. First of all, let's just not get into budget issues of tax and spending. So this 50 kind of just dropped out of nowhere, similar to what the government's doing now by borrowing, right? So they can kind of inject the 50 into the system. Yeah. And so we'll keep that constant. But now, let's say that there is an existing income tax, or we now pass legislation that says taxes are going to be 20%. Will that tend to increase that multiplier bigger than 5, or will it be less than 5? Should be decreased, right? Because in that chain of events, when the 50 channels down to somebody else, we're going to have 20% of it taken out of it. So now there's less money to spend. So if we go back to the way disposable income looks, you're going to have less disposable income, so there's less of that spending being multiplied out. So if we add income tax, then the multiplier will get smaller. Okay, next one. If we add imports, then the multiplier will get what? Bigger or smaller? We now allow us to buy stuff from the rest of the world. Think about that one. So let's track through that. Okay, so big deal. I get my 50 bucks. I can go run to the store, but I can also buy from China. Is that going to make the multiplier business be bigger or smaller if we allow purchases from foreign countries? Smaller? So what's the key part that would tend to make it smaller? Income's going out. So whose income got bigger? Japan, China, wherever we are here, maybe North Korea if they're giving us some goods or we're cooperating with them. So when we buy a foreign good, we're sending the value of that good back over here. And so that's not staying in the loop, right? what we call a leakage out of our system. So we have injections and leakages, so them buying from us gives us more exports, which tends to prop up domestic sales. So if American firms are selling to China, that tends to prop it up. If we buy stuff from China, it tends to reduce the multiplier. So we learned, though, that in the balance payments chapter, that comes back. They've got dollars they need to save, and the capital account must equal the current account, all that business. So, but from the multiplier standpoint purely, holding all of the things constant, if we add imports, then the multiplier will get smaller. Think of those dollars kind of leaking out of our system. Just to kind of bring that back home a little tighter, you know, you sometimes have, here's us, I guess we're a little more over here, here's Ottawa. If we go spend money at Home Depot, is that likely going to help out the Ottawa economy or no? So if we buy stuff from Home Depot as opposed to going to the local Trendle Lumber, Trendle Lumber's got probably a lot of Ottawa people working there, right? So that income stays in Ottawa. So this whole buy local concept is kind of similar. But that can also be destructive potentially. Doesn't necessarily make it right. Things can come back around the other way. But same concept. Leaking out of the local system makes that multiplying effect get smaller. Okay, so how does this tie into aggregate demand and aggregate supply? We're going to draw, in fact, I think I'll put this a little more over to the right here. We're going to draw two graphs stacked on top of each other. This one's, kind of fun. Fun for me. I don't know if it's as fun for you. Hopefully I'll try to make it as fun for you. So up top, we're going to do the model we just did. So go ahead and draw the pieces. Aggregate expenditure, 45-degree line. Short run equilibrium, or this equilibrium point. Let's just call this AE1. Trying to know how this ties into aggregate demand and aggregate supply, so that's what we're going to graph down on the bottom. So we're measuring the price level on the vertical axis, real GDP on the horizontal axis. Now before you start drawing any curves, we're going to link them up right away. They're stacked vertically so that if this level of output is $3,000 worth of GDP, this is $3,000. So that's why we stacked them vertically. And let's just say that this particular level of income happens to be at the current long-run aggregate supply level. So let that kind of anchor down to the potential level for the economy. And then make that a short run as well as a long run equilibrium. Go ahead and draw the short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve as well.
Is this Keynesian or is this just, I don't know.
This is, well, it all kind of, this is in general.
Because I didn't know if we should.
Yeah, no, I'll talk about that in a second. So go ahead and draw it this way for now. All right, so let's map through the change in G again of 50. And we don't have to write 50 this time, but let's have a shift up of some amount. You guys can draw a parallel line. And so we got G1 to G2, an increase in weapons of mass destruction to G2. look like that. So this shift up leads to a greater shift. So our new equilibrium point that we'd expect here would be to push us out to y1. And that initial change of 50 led to $250 worth of income, right? So this vertical shift of 50 led to greater than 50 change in income. All right, well, we learned something from chapter 10 about changes in G. What happened downstairs? Aggregate demand shifts to the out or to the right. So it shifts to the right. Now, we're going to connect these two things up a little differently. Keynes thought that prices were sticky. So now we'll bring in that assumption. Okay, so we'll get this multiplier effect if there's no impact on prices. If prices are purely sticky, not how I drew them before where it had a little bit of slope, but what if it was purely sticky? In other words, they're not going to change. So if that's the case, then that means output would grow from the potential level all the way out to here, which lines nicely up with what we did upstairs, which would be y1. So draw a point right there. And now we're just kind of matching up how far output would increase if there was no price effect. But of course, that's exactly what this model tells us, is that there are going to be price effects. And even Keynes, I think, would concede that it's not perfectly flat. So, in reality, we don't move out to here. But that's where we would be theoretically at that price level. So now draw a parallel aggregate demand, let's call it AD1, through that point that you drew out in that space. Had the price level remained at 100, had the price level remained here, that would have worked out just fine. Little camera adjustment. There we go. But now we see the upward pressure that we predict that would have on inflation. What does that do up here then? What happens to aggregate expenditures if at the same time people are running to the store, but prices are going up at the store? What are they finding in terms of their purchasing power? It's gone down. So this effect is actually somewhat smaller. The real aggregate expenditure line taking a price into effect, we're going to work backwards from this model now up to this one. So this is where we talked about in chapter 10 the economy may head to. Under what circumstances, by the way? We will go up to 105 if what? Resource prices. Ding, 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 ding. But I want a little more to the answer. Resource prices remain the same. Yes. If resource prices remain the same, then we'll head to here. So the assumption that we made, and I'm just making up a number, that nominal resource prices are at $10 an hour. So wage prices remain at 10. That would allow the economy to move from point A to point B. Now we track that up. So let's call this Y2. Now bring that up it back into this diagram until you hit the 45-degree line. And this takes into account, I'm going to have to get a little drawing out here, the aggregate expenditure line at PL1 and G2. If I stay color coordinated here. This one held the price level constant at 100. So the multiplier was less. So there's a price level effect that we didn't even take into account here. The multiplier gets smaller when we take taxes into account. The multiplier gets smaller when we take imports into account. Now we're seeing the multiplier getting smaller as we take a price level effect into account. What's the long run multiplier? What's the long run multiplier? How much does our $50 million of government spending get us in terms of increased output in the long run? If I had to fill this equation out, what is the long run multiplier? I know it's not 5 already, it's something smaller. The change in G, what is in the long run?
What is the price level?
Well, the price level got us at least up to this red line. What's the change in the economy in the long run? Who's brave? Somebody sees something, I hope. Where is the economy headed in the long run? Remember that from earlier? The economy in the long run is headed towards where? The intersection of what? Aggregate demand and long run aggregate supply. So your eyeball should gravitate towards this point for where the economy's headed in the long run, which means what's the multiplier in the long run? Is it 5? Is it 10? Is it 4? Is it 1? Let's see what would happen if it was 1. So 1 times 50 equals 50. Did we get a bump up of 50? We got a bump of 0. Oh! That's supposed to be your big aha moment that there is no multiplier in the long run. So that increase in government spending eventually kind of fizzles out into inflation. Kind of like printing money did in a sense. Right? The long run adjustments is that just spending money isn't good enough. Now, we'll talk later on if the government spent money on a highway that helped businesses bring stuff to their business and made them more productive, and then they hired more people and those people have more income, then that could be a good thing for the economy. But if the government just buys $50 million worth of, I don't know, toilet paper or something else, or pays, worse yet, $50 million to have Cedar Street dug up and then put back down because we wanted to create jobs, right? Did you guys hear some of this mantra when we were going through the crisis? We're going to create jobs. Obama was saying, I'm going to create jobs. Mitt Romney might have said, we got to look for jobs. But if you dig a little deeper, is that helping the economy out if I hire you guys to go dig that ditch over there by that building and then the next day you come in and I say, I want you to fill that hole back in. Was anything new in the world created? No, there was nothing, right? So nothing productive changed. There was no additional productive capacity created. There was no resource changes that allowed there to be more stuff in the long run. So it's not good enough to just spend money, I guess, at the end of the day. The Cash for Clunkers program I had a real problem with. What was that deal? You guys remember how the Cash for Clunkers program, did you guys have parents or other people participate in the program? Yeah, you got Cash for Clunkers, doesn't matter what it is, you got a $5,000 credit or whatever, and then the dealership, even if it was a working car, so that might be a good deal. So let's say suppose you're driving around a decent $3,500 car. How many of you have a $3,500 car or less? Raise your hand. Good show of hands. $3,500 or less. Probably 10 of you at least, right? I've got a $3,500 vehicle myself, probably worth next to nothing. I might have to pay you to take it away, but it helps to move stuff around. So there's a lot of those cars around. Can those cars still be productive in helping you live your lives or possibly even run a business? Yeah. So what the government did was told you to go dig that ditch and then the next day come fill the ditch in. Potentially, in a sense, there was a little bit of value added, but those cars had to be destroyed. That was part of the program. So when they traded in the car, when you do it the good old-fashioned way, right? You trade in your car, the salesman talks it up and says, here's your new car, here's our old car, oh, we can give you a lot of money for that. And then he goes and resells that to somebody else, maybe a college student, to use as their college car, right? And so it still stayed in the economy as a productive asset. But this particular program was to give $5,000 for some vehicle of questionable value and then destroy the car on top of that. So that's a questionable use of our resources. And in this case, it wasn't even our tax dollars, it was your guys' future tax dollars that probably went to that program, since there really wasn't enough taxes to pay for that program or any other program for that matter, since they were running $1 trillion deficit. So that's just a glimmer of why this isn't so far-fetched. In the long run, you can't spend your way out of a recession. In the long run, you can't spend your way out of a recession. The economy is eventually going to get back to whatever it's supposed to be at. How long does it take? I don't know. We're going to keep chipping away at that question. But eventually we get to, let's call it PL2 here at 108. Again, just making up some numbers. And once we get back to there, that means the long run multiplier was Zippo. The real aggregate expenditure at PL2 and G2 is right back to where we started. There is no multiplier. That's one of the key things I think we bring up here. So, key point. In the long run, the multiplier is, not when you have to use a mirror before you, I don't know how that works with my brain, is 0. And just to be sure what we're doing here, the change in y times the multiplier, which I won't even do the whole formula, but let's say multiplier times the change in g is 0. 0 times whatever equals 0. 0 change in output. You can't, the moral of the story is you can't just spend your way out of recession. you can't just spend your way out of recession. Now, one thing I will say is it does depend on what you're spending on. If G is spent on resources, and I better be careful there and say productive resources. Again, it does nothing to go buy a tractor and then let it sit in a building somewhere. If G is spent on productive resources, then there is hope. So I'm holding you, American public. I think everybody's American here. Is anybody not American? Okay. I mean, we sometimes have foreign students, so I was making a legitimate question. So I'm leaving it in your hands. The next political campaign, the next election, whatever's going on, you need to ask the more critical question. What are you spending the money on? It's not just easy to have a program and spend money. You need to be spending it in a strategic way, in something that is productive. So if G is spent on productive resources, then there is hope. You, and I do mean you, need to hold policymakers responsible. And this might mean that you have to be a little active or help spread the good word of economics. You need to hold policymakers responsible to spend wisely. Now, that's a big question. You're going to get different argument on what's wise and what's not. And should we spend on weapons to protect ourselves? Should we not? Is it worth it investing in pre-K education or not? I'm just kind of touching the surface of things, and that's what we're going to spend time in chapter 13. So the lesson here was to think about how does autonomous spending affect the economy? There's this potential multiplier effect in the short run. Most economists would probably argue that there's some sort of multiplying effect. The argument comes in as whether it's longer lasting or not. Is it worth it? Or is it eventually just going to kind of fizzle out and not be worth doing to begin with? And if you're doing it by borrowing, you're just shifting the burden onto the next generation or the next taxpayers down the road. Okay, so questions or comments on that? All right, so I'm going to stick with this inflation stuff a little bit longer. We hinted at the policy trade-offs between inflation and unemployment and real GDP earlier. So I want to bring that back to the forefront of our mind. 3 goals: increase output, low stable inflation, and low unemployment. An economist by the name of Phillips started doing some research and was thinking about these trade-offs. he looked at a long-range study of unemployment and inflation. Unemployment and inflation. So we're introducing a kind of a new model, a new graph, where we've got two of our biggies planted here, right? Got inflation that we'd like to keep ideally low and stable, and we'd also like to keep unemployment low. After looking at nearly 100 years worth of data from Great Britain, he collected a data point from 1 year that maybe was there in 1756. And in 1757 and 1864 and 1737, 1726, and he did some statistical analysis over this long history, and it looks something like that. So this is what economists do. We collect data and then we try to interpret data. What does that look like to you, that little cloud of points? How are those two things related to each other? Unemployment's high when inflation is low, and vice versa. So that's a what type of relationship? Negative. One goes up, the other goes down. They seem to be negatively correlated with each other. Not sure if there's... He's just looking at the data and notice that there seems to be this trade-off. And so we can use some statistics. You guys have done it. Those of you who've had some class in, you might have even started to do some regression, or you'll get towards that at the end of the semester if you had a statistics class. And so we can kind of fit a line that shows the average relationship. And this became known as the Phillips curve.
It's stuck with a lot of people, I guess.
You didn't learn about it?
We did.
Yes, we did.
Oh.
Don't remember.
Don't remember, okay. And you might not have, depending on what class you had. But I know Dr. Tyner here does hit that, but if you're taking it now, I don't think he's probably there yet.
Yeah.
He does.
There's like a third thing you do.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, there you go.
Chapter 9.
So Phillips did this in the mid-50s. So this was in about the 1950s. And this was after Keynes wrote his book. Keynes wrote his book in what time frame roughly? We had 1936, the general theory. Big government entering the play. Hey, maybe we can tinker around with the economy and offset the swings in the business cycle. And so this is what Phillips brought to the table in the academic professional journals. So policymakers started thinking, well, what do I want? Do I want high unemployment or low unemployment? And if I do, that's going to be at the expense of inflation. So we start to see a policy trade-off. A policy trade-off. Low unemployment for high inflation, or high inflation for low unemployment. So if you're a policymaker, politician, let's get into an elected official, which one do you think you'd prefer? Low unemployment. Why?
It's good for the economy.
Good for the economy, but I mean low stable inflation is too, but if you had to choose, I'd agree with you, low unemployment, why else maybe? I agree with you, good for the economy. Okay, people be too busy working to worry about things costing too much. Better to have some money than no money, so we're kind of spreading things out a little bit, even if it's at kind of the cost of prices being higher, but at least everybody's working, you know. People tend to, what'd you say on welfare? Won't have as many people on welfare, good. So less assistance programs if more people are working. Voters tend to be happy when they have a job. They'll probably tend to keep you in office, so that might be a good reason for officials. So there's a number of different things that I think your guys' gut feeling is exactly the way policymakers started to think. And we started to head towards this being more of a target. And this is really some support possibly for increased government. Now, the problem with that is that the government continued to grow and spend, and things were working out pretty good. You know, we might have had 1960, 1961, 1962, 1963, 1964, 1965, 1966, 67, 68, 69, 70, 71, 72. Whoops. People started thinking, is the Phillips curve broken? Right? This was 100 years worth of data. This guy's a good economist, well respected. Did he screw up? We started seeing data points up here, which isn't good, right? Because as we start to move this direction, we've got the high inflation that we expected and high unemployment. That was the 1970s. All right, so something went weird here, and economists went back to the drawing board to figure out what's going on. Well, what do you think happened? What's that? Baby boom, okay. There might have been some demographic changes that needed to be explored.
You said the 70s, right?
Yeah. So we had the 70s, oil prices were kind of going up. We had a number of different factors coming into the economy that after economists started to explore that, they started thinking twice about this relationship. Now, if we go back to our aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve, what does it say the relationship is in the long run between prices and unemployment? What does it say about prices and unemployment? There is none. Why? I don't see unemployment here, so we've talked about it before, but I want to make sure everybody's on the same page. Where's unemployment on this graph? It's not directly there, but it's indirectly there. What do you see?
It's the supply.
The supply. So there's a connection here between this and unemployment. What is unemployment right here? Not zero, but the natural rate of unemployment. So that's our connection here, is that, wait a second, there's some amount of unemployment that we would tend to naturally gravitate to regardless of government programs, monetary policy, fiscal policy, changes like that. The things that lead to long-term economic growth, shifts of the long-run aggregate supply curve, are LAS shifters, technology, good, resources, quantity of resources, right? So the quantity of our bucket of resources, land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. There could have been some baby boomer effects, you know, that might have helped shift this to the right. That's long-term economic growth, investments long-term in education, all the stuff we talked about in Chapter 6. But shifting around government spending and monetary policy, those are all potentially short-run effects. So now if we come back to here, what does that mean for the Phillips curve? Well, somewhere along this axis lies the natural rate of unemployment. And in the long run, there shouldn't be any connection, predicted anyway, between inflation and the unemployment rate. It's going to be what it's going to be. And so the long run Phillips curve, I'll do it with a big R here, I guess. The long run Phillips curve is no curve at all. There's no relationship. Now, unless old Phillips really screwed up, there is some connection, but we were missing something. What do you think maybe happened to the Phillips curve over this time frame that would at least help try to figure out it shifted up? It's got some sort of shifter that we didn't know about prior to that. And what we now have come to determine through some work of an economist that recently got the Nobel Prize in economics for some of his work on expectations, that the Phillips curve could shift, and there's a difference between the short run Phillips curve and the long run Phillips curve. And so if it shifts up, perhaps things could center around that spot as economic activity goes with a recessionary gap or an inflationary gap kind of swinging around here. There might be some data that looks like that, but it's when expectations are constant. So for the United States story, historically, people's expectation of what the inflation rate was going to be was very stable. They didn't have any reason to believe that it wasn't going to be 2% to 3% per year. So maybe they were expecting inflation of 3%. They didn't really understand what was going on at the time. They were just behaving according to what the market was doing, and inflation was going up. So the 1970s was a period of time where the United States saw inflation rates like they'd never seen before. We got up to like 12% inflation. So the jump in the inflation rate went up, and people started to expect that. So they started to ask for pay raises, resource prices. All of those price adjustments tended to happen together. We just kind of got used to a new higher rate. And so because of what had happened with fiscal policy and monetary policy over time, people adjusted their expectations up. So there is, and I'm just kind of making up numbers here, but let's say it's 6%. So for this real relationship, there's a short run Phillips curve and a long run Phillips curve. In the long run, we don't expect there to be any relationship. So I'm going to tighten that up so we don't have all the dots on it. Let's see.
So that's the first one.
So let's put on here connecting the Phillips curve and aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Now we're going to put two graphs side by side with each other. Not directly connected, but loosely connected. All right, long run equilibrium in the goods market, our aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework. Over here, we draw the Phillips curve with inflation on the vertical axis and unemployment on the horizontal. drawing the long run Phillips curve, just a vertical line that's anchored at the natural rate of unemployment. An unemployment rate that only includes frictional and structural unemployment. Good, you got it. So here's the connection to think about. That's the rate of unemployment that occurs when we're at our potential level of output. Okay, and initially, there may be some sort of trade-off. And this is the expected level of inflation. As we saw in our money chapter, money and inflation are closely related. One of our policy goals is to have low, stable inflation, so we'd like to have that be fairly stable. Right now, that's a variable that's under close scrutiny by the Federal Reserve. They're not, in fact, Ben Bernanke has come out and said, we're not going to allow inflation to get up, I can't remember what the target was, 2.5. As soon as it gets up to 2.5, then they'd be putting the brakes on it. Otherwise, they're going to continue their monetary policy until unemployment comes down to 6.5, I think. So this is like one of the first times in a long, maybe ever, that the Federal Reserve has come out and told people what their target is. So we're going to keep letting loose money out into the system. Now we know Milton Friedman's warning is you put out loose money, it's going to be inflationary. So he's watching these two variables pretty closely. All right. So how do we form an expectation? There's a couple types of expectations. One is called an adaptive expectation. And that is simply looking at, well, what was it last year? I predict that this year's is going to be what it was last year. And so you just simply, this year's is expected to be what last year's was. We do that quite a bit, right? So that seems one approach to forming an expectation. Inflation was 3% last year. I think it's going to be 3% this year. Now, if I get burned and inflation actually turns out to be 4%, then next year I'm going to say I think it's going to be 4% this year. And if I get burned again and it actually was 5% instead of 4%, then next year I say, oh, I think it's going to be 5%, right? So I'm always looking backwards. Not what I guess savvy investors would want to do. Not what economists would do. Economists are in the prediction business of using some economic models to try to forecast what the inflation rate is going to be based on all available information. And so imagine, you'll be surprised by this title that came out of this research, kind of from what's went on in the 1970s. We have a rational expectation. A rational expectation is an expectation based on all available information. An expectation based on all available information. So we're going to collect information, we'll look at some historical data. It might be important to know what it was last year, but that's not how we're going to make our expectation. We're going to use maybe a little more sophisticated items. If we're an unsophisticated individual, then we'll rely on sophisticated people to tell us what they think inflation's going to be. So an expectation that's based on all available information. Here's what characteristics we expect of a rational expectation. One is that it's correct on average. Correct on average, and we should expect relatively small forecast error. So maybe you remember from your statistics class having a little error term, standard deviation and variance, right? All that fun stuff. So do you remember thinking about the bell curve? And you might have used like boxes here, but maybe you've heard of the bell curve. So what's the height of this normal distribution? Yes, is that, did you call it the normal, or I didn't hear what you said, but so
Yeah, Mom. You got it.
are you nailing it? So if I expect the temperature today to be 70 degrees, which is a little, maybe I should be more realistic. What is it today, 50 outside? All right, fine, 50 degrees. How did I hear that? How did I come to expect that? Did I just look outside and see that it's sunny? Or did I catch it on the news? I heard the weatherman. I pulled up an app on my phone, right? Where did the information from the app on the phone come from? Sophisticated people or unsophisticated people? Sophisticated people, right? So we're going to base our expectation on all available information. So is it possible that the temperature could end up being 51 degrees? Yes. Could it be 49 degrees? Yes. But we expect it to be not very wrong by much. So that's what we mean by forming a rational expectation. We'll pick up there next time.